Oh, hello, I didn't see you there. Welcome back to Aaron's 1972 Datsun 510. A little sneak preview of what's going to happen in the future. Sometime we're going to put these seats in. They're from a Mercedes CLK. But today, we're going to move back to the rust repair. Since we'll soon be moving to the back of the car, we're going to go ahead and remove the fuel tank, and moving to the front of the car, we have to rebuild this piece. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to remove the fuel tank, and then I'm going to come here, build this piece out while the whole back of the car airs out. But let's get to it. I start out first by removing all of the items from the trunk, to include the spare tire, the jack, the battery box, but I also have to get the parcel shelf out that protects the tank from getting sort of smacked by random objects. That's held in by two 8mm bolts, I believe, it might be 10mm bolts, as well as two screws that go into the floor of the trunk. I then had to sort of work with the fuel tank filler hose to get it out of the way. Of note, the top breather hose actually got broken as I removed that piece. I then had to remove the plywood firewall here in the back of the car, so that's just held in with a whole bunch of Phillips head screws. Once I got that done, I was able to access the additional bolts around the tank, which I believe were 12 or 14mm, and those just came right off and allowed me to then move the pieces. I did have to cut this fuel line down underneath the car, so I'll need to replace that whenever it all goes back together. I actually used a little bit of tubing to catch the gas as it was coming out. I ended up was able to fill up an entire gas can out of this, and so as well as a tiny bit in my secondary gas can. So I just wanted to get all of the fuel out of there so that way I could remove it from the car, the gas tank that is, a lot easier. Probably one of my favorite things about this was whenever I looked inside the fuel tank after getting it out, I realized that I'm not going to have to do another video where I clean a gas tank, because it actually was in pretty good shape. Here I go ahead and purge the line using some compressed air. Nothing weird here, just a guy draining gasoline from gas tank. Alright, so now I'm going to get the battery box out. I'm sure some of you will remember that I put that battery box in there. I used 4 bolts, and so I just had to unscrew those 4 bolts and remove the battery box. It wasn't that difficult. I then had some paint stripper on the shelf that I've had for quite a while, and I'm just trying to remove this old coating that someone put on right over the original paint. By the way, most of this paint in the back was really good shape. The idea that I had to use this nasty stuff and then all this tar, oh man, pain in the butt. So one of the things that I am planning on doing to the car is actually putting a battery box in. I over-engineered the crap out of this thing. It's way heavier metal than it needs to be, but I just went ahead. I've got a whole bunch of extra sheet metal anyway, so I bent up a battery box, and you see me right now measuring out the battery to ensure that it'll fit the piece that I need it to fit. This is one of these times where I actually decided to, instead of just immediately start cutting and fixing it as I go, that I was going to measure things out, and I was going to create a nice template and then go from there. I ended up only making about half of the template and then rotating it on the metal whenever I cut it out to make the other half of the template. The battery box will not contain the entire battery. The battery will actually stick up out of the battery box by about 1.5 inches plus the terminals. This will allow it to, I couldn't sink a battery box any lower in the car due to the lower drop panel that I'm going to be installing inside the fender here. So I knew this going in, and so I actually ended up making for sure that I didn't sort of paint myself into a corner as I created this battery box. Of note to future builders, if you're watching my channel for inspiration, this metal is way too thick. I just want to remind you that it might seem smart to get nice thick metal that you can use, But understand that whenever you're taking a sheet of metal and then you're bending it into a shape, that the amount of extra strength that you are going to induce by making a small piece with bends in it is so much stronger than it is over a large sheet that has no bends in it. So don't over-engineer this stuff. You're just making your life more difficult. My wonderful Harbor Freight metal brake couldn't even bend these things, so I ended up having to use a hammer and pliers and just body weight to muscle it into place, which overall turns into not as good of a finish of a product. So I like the way it turned out. I definitely think it's good, but I would tell you that, you know, if I were doing this again, I would say, Aaron, get less thick metal so that way you can work with it much easier as you move forward. But some gentle persuasion with a nice big hammer definitely helps as you move forward on these kind of things. How satisfying is taking that nasty looking black crap off this wheel well? It's just so much better looking already. I started out with a metal putty knife. The metal putty knife was not contouring around the shapes as well and was leaving a lot of scratches in the paint. Not that I'm going to keep this paint, I'm going to take it out. But I ended up using a plastic spread knife or putty knife after using this for a while, and it can contour to the shapes much better as I move. Out of all of the parts on this car, the spare tire well actually was in decent shape, which is clearly a first. The metal was all strong, and I'm very happy that I don't need to cut out the metal here. So I spread the I spread the stripper with an old paintbrush. I don't know if that was the right call, but it seemed to work just fine. I hope you like that star wipe. And then I went on to the battery box. So my son Cooper has been wanting to help, and I didn't want him crawling around under the car or handling an angle grinder quite yet. I don't really want to take him to the emergency room and explain why my son lost a finger. So I think a battery box is the first great opportunity to do something on the car. And I will say, since then, he actually has commented to his friends as well as his siblings how he was the one who made that battery box. So that sense of pride is there, which is really pretty cool to see. Me teaching him to weld is definitely the blind leading the blind out here, but hey, what are you going to do? A simple bead down each edge is what we use in order to secure. It's times like this I wish I had a more steady welding table, and regret the placement of the car that blocks my actual workbench from being used regularly. Fade to trunk. In a world. No, I'm just kidding. So the stripper works pretty well, but this is the third application of it, and I wasn't getting much off during this subsequent pass. I also had to remove the weather stripping from around the trunk as I needed to weld near there. And I'd already removed a large amount from the driver's side, so I'm going to end up having to actually remove the entirety of this, and I actually already ordered a new trunk seal, so I'll go ahead and clean that whenever it becomes time. Continuing to remove the gunk from the trunk. Sorry, I just made myself giggle a little bit. I switched over to the plastic scraper. That actually did a much better job of contouring to the shape around the spare tire well. And once I got done with that, you'll see me finally remove the trunk seal. So will be good and done. But definitely looks so much better inside the trunk from whenever we started. Check out this before shot versus this after shot. Sorry, it's from a different angle, but I think you get the point of how much crap I removed from this thing. It was disgusting. Look, it's not perfect, but I wanted to get a lot of the crappy, I don't know what to call it, rock chip that was in here out of here. And as you've seen over the past several minutes of me just digging at it, I've got a good portion of it done. I actually just sprayed a little bit of WD-40 over the top, so I hopefully don't get any flash rust tonight, but I think I'm done for a little bit. Also made the battery box. Shout out to Cooper, who got his first taste of welding. Some good welds there. So anyway, this is going to wrap up this random episode, not really along the same vein as the rest of them, just because I needed to take out the fuel tank, and I wanted to make sure that the fuel tank had enough time to empty the gas smell and the gas vapors out of my garage before I went back to welding and cutting on this car. So tomorrow we'll be back to, or next episode, we'll be back to working on the bodywork again. So thanks for watching. GoPro, stop recording.